In the Introduction to Anthropology lecture, I was talking about three different things that make anthropology different from other social sciences or other fields that study humans. And one of those things was the culture concept. And culture is a pretty important thing to anthropology, so I'm going to devote a whole lecture on culture so we can talk about its different parts, so you feel like you really understand what culture is. So, one of the first working definitions of culture that anthropologists used came from Edward Tyler. And I don't know if you remember him, but he was one of the gentlemen that was perpetuating the idea of unilinear evolutionism. So, this goes to show you that even though you might have a bad idea, sometimes you have good ideas too. So, this early definition that we were using said that culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So, one of the most important aspects of this definition that he's giving us is acquired, and that's why I have bolded it. Because culture is learned. You're not born with it, you have to acquire it from the people around you. So, one of the definitions that I'm going to use for this class, it's a little bit smaller than his definition above, is a society's shared and socially transmitted ideas, values, and perceptions. And so these ideas, values, and perceptions help us make sense of our world and speak to the behavior that others see us do. So, for example, how people deal with death is based on their ideas of where that comes from, it's based on their culture. So, while someone may be subscribing to a Judeo Christian belief, may say that a death that happens is God's will, another culture may say, well, it was a witch. For example, we're going to be talking about a culture in the weeks to come called the Azande in Africa. And whenever anyone dies, they always look for the witch that did it. And so those are two different ways to deal with death, but it is spoken to by the culture, and that's how they decide how to deal with those things. Or you can see a culture's values and certain behaviors. Think about the value Americans place on personal space, especially if you come here from the Midwest. You probably have gotten on an elevator before, and if you're the only one on there and someone else gets on, what's your first instinct? You kind of want to move to the other side, right? And if they come right next to you, you're going to feel uncomfortable. And that's not necessarily something that's built into you. You have had to learn that you don't want people that close to you. And you know you've learned that, at least I know that because I'm raising a toddler right now. And let me tell you, they don't know what personal space is. And so for me to make my toddler an acceptable member of society, I have to make sure he gets out of people's space. And so I'm going to have to teach him that. Which gets us to this next thing. And the next slides that we're going to go over, you're going to see culture is, and then you're going to see an adjective, and then I'm going to expand on that adjective. So our first adjective is culture is learned. And the process by which a society gives culture, or by the way culture is put in you, is called enculturation. So you have to learn how to do things. And there are certain things that you do in your everyday life that you just kind of don't think about the fact that you had to be taught that. When you go to a fast food restaurant and you see that there's one cashier and someone is already ordering, what do? Do you get in line? Did you always know how to get in lines? Where did you learn how to get into a line? And I can tell you right now, my toddler, he does not know how to get into a line right now. And so that's something he's going to have to learn. And when we read Golden Arches East, which is one of the last book we read, you'll see that when McDonald's came to some Asian countries, they had to be taught how to get into lines because that's just not how they did it. They had a different way and everyone got their turn, but it was not through the orderly line that you have grown up with. Or think about when you want to ask a question in class, what do? I guess on online class it doesn't count, but if you're in class, you raise your hand, right? Who taught you to raise your hand? And do you think that's something you were born with? I can tell you that's not true because my toddler, when he wants to ask me a question, he does not raise his hand. And so that's something he's going to have to learn when he goes to school. And it's interesting because he watches Sesame Street and they even have a song that's teaching kids how to raise their hand. So that's society teaching kids this is how you act appropriately in school. Another way cultures learn, think about what you think is okay to eat. So I'm going to show you some pictures. Think to yourself, is this in general something okay to eat in our culture? I know some of you might be vegetarians or might be restricted by religious beliefs, but in general, is cow easy to, or easy, I hope so, it's easy to eat. Is cow okay to eat? You probably see a lot of eat beef license plates around Kansas, especially as you go more western Kansas. So yeah, we eat beef. Chicken okay? Mmm. Pig? Yep. Guinea pig. Have any of you guys ever had guinea pig before? If you want, you're welcome to click on this link. But in Peru, especially with indigenous people, guinea pig was a important meat source. You can raise them in the home and you make sure that your door is a little bit of a step up so the guinea pigs can't escape. Time for dinner, grab a delicious guinea pig and you're good to go. It's made of meat too, but you have been taught that that is a pet while people in other cultures eat that. What about dog? I know that kind of upsets you guys, and I know I always get upset to know that people eat cats because I'm a huge cat fan, but it, all these things here are made of meat, and you have been taught that one is your friend and the other is your food. And pigs are actually really smart. They're smarter than dogs, but we eat pigs and we don't eat dogs, at least in this culture. So maybe you guys have had some interesting experiences, interesting things you've eaten. I've eaten camel burgers before. You maybe have had alligator, or maybe some of you who hunt or know hunters have had interesting game of the forest that others have not. And so just think about where you learned that. And it's not innate because lots of people eat different things. People eat horse, people eat insects, but you had to be taught that you don't eat certain foods. But like I said, they're all made of meat. Culture is shared. You have to have other people that share that culture. You can't have personal culture. I've seen that in books before, and I just always thought that was an interesting use of culture because culture is something that's shared. And because culture is shared, your actions are intelligible to other members in the society. And that means that you can, in general, when you're around people that are in your culture, can predict the way they're going to behave. One of my favorite examples is when you're walking, especially like when you're walking into school and you see someone in front of you and they're opening the door and going through it, you probably assume that they're going to hold the door for you. And if they don't, you might get a little peeved if they let the door slam in your face because you assume they're going to hold that door for you. But there are lots of cultures where you don't necessarily have to hold the door for someone. And I always see when people are kind of fighting their culture in their brain, because you've ever been there where you can't decide if the person behind you is going to make it, and you don't really want to hold the door because it's going to take some time, and you don't really want to make them run up the stairs, but you hold it and you did make them run up the stairs. So were you really being polite by holding the door, but then they had to huff it up the stairs? Who knows? But in our culture, you hold the door, so you kind of don't want to break that as well. Culture is shared by members of a society. So culture is an abstract concept. I can't touch your beliefs, your ideas, your values, right? But it is shared by members of a society, and society is a concrete concept. Remember, that's what I was telling you. Sociologists will study society, and those are people, and you can count people. The interesting thing about culture, though, is that it's shared but not uniform, and you know that. If you're around other people living in America, you probably notice that there are certain things you share, but there are things that aren't shared. And one concept we can talk about that displays this is the idea of the behavior arc and the imperative of selection. So the behavior arc is actually not very archy, it's actually a line. So the behavior arc are all the behaviors you could choose for any situation. So let's say you are getting ready for school, and I bet you have a lot of options when you open your closet or your dresser drawer or your car, wherever you need to get clothes out of to get to where you need to go. And you probably saw like some prom dresses or some swimsuits or what have you. And if you're in the Midwest right now, you've kind of been, you see a lot of options, but there's only so many options you want to pick from because it's cold outside. And we call the pieces you need to pick to not stand out the imperative of selection. So the imperative of selection represented by this triangle. You can tell I'm not a math major. The square is the behaviors you need to choose from to not stick out. So when I ask my face-to-face classes, like, what do you see around class that, or I should say around campus, that is outside of the imperative selection? They'd probably say someone, well, I saw someone not wearing shoes. They always pick on this poor guy who doesn't have shoes on. Or, people who wear tails, or people who are maybe showing up in shorts when it's 32 degrees out. And so they have picked outside of the imperative of selection when we talk about what in this particular behavior arc of what to wear for class or what to wear to campus. But just because they picked outside and they call attention to themselves because they're outside of it, it doesn't mean they're not a part of our culture. I mean, they'll probably still hold the door open for you. They have just picked a behavior that, because they picked outside of the imperative selection, they stand out a little bit more. Another idea where we talk about shared but not uniform are subcultures. So these are groups of people who are within a larger society, but they have distinct set of standards and behavior patterns. And I bet a lot of you guys are a part of different subcultures based on your interests or your profession, maybe even your major in school, where you, of course, you're a part of the larger culture, but you have different ways of thinking about things. So maybe you are a workout person, and you have to imagine that obviously the yoga subculture is very different from the individuals in the CrossFit culture. They have different standards, different behavior patterns, different ways of thinking, different ways of talking. Maybe you were in band or you played a sport, and obviously that set you apart from other groups when you were in high school. But everyone's got this, and it just, you're still a part of a larger society, but you just have a little bit different way of thinking about things. Ethnic groups also fit into this. So, ethnic groups are just a group of people who have lumped themselves together either because of ancestry or language, customs, traditional beliefs. It can be some, all of those. Ethnic groups aren't necessarily, what do I want to say here? It's not like people make them up, but at the same time, ethnicity is oftentimes what you say you are and what people will accept you as. Because I've had students where there were two sisters I had, and they had a African American parent and they had a Mexican parent. And phenotypically or physically, they looked African American. But one sister associated more with her Mexican heritage, and the other sister associated more with her African American heritage. And you have to think about, is there a checklist for a certain ethnic group? You want to call yourself Mexican American. Oh, did you hit all these 10 criteria to be Mexican American? No, there's nothing like that. But ethnic groups themselves, once they identify as one, then you just have to make sure that other people call you that and other people will accept you as that. And we've seen different ethnic groups around here, and they have become a part of the American fabric, but they themselves may come together to celebrate what we have listed here that make them that ethnic group. So culture is symbolic. Here's the definition of a symbol if you want to have that. But symbol is just making something else stand for something. And if you are a part of a culture, you often take for granted that you know what all the symbols mean until you are introduced to another culture and maybe you're not as fully aware as to what that means. So, for example, if you go to a wedding, you're probably, and you are of the American culture, you're probably pretty aware of what the rings are standing for, why they throw the bouquet, why the bride is wearing white. Those things, you understand that because you're a part of that culture. But if you've ever gone to a wedding from a different culture and maybe the bride's wearing red and not white, or they jump the broom or they break the glass and they're doing something different that maybe you don't understand what's going on because you are not a part of that culture, so you don't understand the symbol. Language itself is symbolic. So we decided that this symbol here is going to make the duh sound, and this is going to make the ah, and this is going to make the guh. And when we put these three symbols together, it's going to stand for this creature right here. So language is symbolic. We have created certain symbols, and they don't innately have those sounds because maybe you've seen other cultures use the same letters, but they have different sounds. That's especially true when you see Celtic names, and they'll have the same letters, but it'll have a completely different pronunciation because they have assigned different sounds to those particular symbols. Think about people coming into our country and they see the majestic but not indigenous elephant and the majestic donkey that are representing our political parties. What must they think we think about our political parties to pick these particular animals? And you also see colors here. Like, if you were looking at a map on election night, that when you saw red, that was Republican, and if you saw blue, that was Democrat. But people in our culture don't know that. And color can be very symbolic. You've maybe known this if you've ever had a kid or gone to a baby shower, and we have decided that certain colors are masculine and certain colors are feminine, and you have been raised by that. But is that truly, do all human groups think of that? And maybe you know this and maybe you don't, but the colors for boys and girls used to be switched, and red used to be a boy color, or I should say pink was a boy color, because they thought it was derived from red, which was a very masculine color, and then light blue was a feminine color, and then that switched towards the middle of the 20th century. And so what those meant changed. And you know the colors that we wear for weddings and we wear for funerals, but that's very different as we look around the world. And I think the symbols become more obvious to you when you go to a culture that doesn't have the same symbols as you. I lived in Spain for a while, and my husband came to visit me, and he just had a field day taking pictures of their signs because he thought they were so hilarious. And this was in a museum, and he thought this was the beaver dangling station. You see the person holding the beaver by the back legs. And maybe some of you know that this is a baby changing station, but it's a hover baby changing station. But that's not necessarily the symbol we use in our culture for baby changing station. Culture is adaptive. Think about all the changes that cultures have to deal with, and they have to adapt to them to wrap their culture around new technologies, new ideas. Think about how cell phones changed our lives. And maybe some of you were around before cell phones existed. So, think about what you did when your car broke down on the highway. Oh my gosh, what did you do? You had to rely on the kindness of strangers, right? But think about how cell phones have changed our behavior, how it's changed our infrastructure. Do you guys remember these commercials? When you had to actually call a phone number to dial long distance. Now you can just call whoever you want on your cell phone. Think about companies like this that no longer exist, or think about payphones. Do we need payphones anymore? Some of you might use them, but they're not as prevalent as they used to be. Think about how people act. When I walk up to my classroom and my students are sitting there, do you think they're talking to each other? No, they're looking at their phone. Have you ever been out with someone, like you are out to dinner with a person to hang out with them, and what are they doing? They are interacting with other people on their phone. It has changed the way we walk around, the way we look, the way we interact with people. I was playing a game with my son a few months ago where I was pretending I had a phone and it was ringing, and I said, "It's for you." And my husband pointed out, are we ever going to really say that to him? Because we don't have a home phone, and home phones are slowly going obsolete. And if someone calls you, of course it's for you because they called your cell phone. So will my son even need to say that? So certain linguistic phrases may be obsolete as well. But our culture's adapted over it. Our infrastructure's changed. Now we have cell phone towers, cell phone companies, people making cell phones. So things have had to really change. And think about where you get your information, who you depend on, what a phone means to you. It's all changed. Culture is always changing. So if you're a smaller culture that doesn't have a lot of interaction with other groups of people, of course your culture is going to change a little slower. But if you're a culture like ours that is constantly interacting with people around the world, things are always going to be changing. Think about the things we say. I am old enough, I'm not super old, but I'm old enough where these phrases pop up and I don't know what they mean. I do know what this means, but there was a funny tweet that I remember a police station had put out where they said people should stay home and watch Netflix and chill. And people were laughing at them because they obviously had no idea what that meant. And if you're looking at this and saying, I have no idea what that means, maybe urbandictionary.com and you'll learn a lot. BAE, that's a new thing. For me, that stands for the Bureau of American Ethnology, but I think that has a new definition in the past couple years. Bye, Felicia. That was something I had to teach my husband, and it was a very difficult concept to teach him what was going on there. And these things you may just understand, but if you're older or younger and you just have no idea what's going on, or you're just not really plugged into this kind of culture, then people will say these things to you, and you may be like, my name's not Felicia, so I'm confused. A really excellent way to see how our culture is changing is think about fashion. You may look at yourself in pictures from 10, 15 years ago and be thinking, what was I wearing? But that was what people did. You can look at the difference in the wedding photos between Princess Diana, who got married, I think, either late 70s or 80s, and then her son that got married in the past couple years, and notice the difference even in wedding clothes. When I got married in 2011, a lot of nice older women were bringing me their wedding photos and showing me when they got married in the 70s and the 80s, and they had these big, puffy shoulders and lots of flowers. And when you go to weddings now, you don't see sleeves hardly anymore. And it's a lot different look, a little bit more streamlined, and you can see the difference in her daughter-in-law, who I think wearing sleeves, that's not as that might be growing in popularity, but it wasn't as popular when she did it. But just notice the complete difference that 30 years made in wedding attire. And it kind of makes you wonder what our kids are going to think is cool to wear. Even me looking at what people are wearing to prom, I think, man, that's a lot different than what I wore to prom so many years ago. Culture affects our biology and vice versa. What do I mean by that? There are certain biological functions and reactions that you can't necessarily control. Think about what makes you cry, what makes you throw up, what makes you scared. For us, we were talking about what certain animals mean to us that we learn. So if we saw a dog get hit by a car and die, that would probably make us cry. But do you really think someone who believes dog to be a delicious meat would really be upset by that? Or, if you were served that kind of meat on a sandwich, that might make you not feel good to your stomach, but other people aren't going to feel that. Or what makes you become scared, kind of put you in that fight or flight mode. We live in a more suburban urban area, and we really feel like nature belongs outside. So if you see a spider in your house, you might freak out. You've seen people on the news who burned their house down because they made a blowtorch out of hairspray and a lighter. I mean, do you think Native Americans who lived in teepees, the ones on the plains, would become as scared as we do over spiders? Probably not. And so these biological reactions depend on your culture. And I say vice versa because there are certain things that it goes the other way around. Puberty is something that happens to all humans, or most humans, I should say. And it's a biological thing we go through, but how cultures deal with it vary. Some cultures completely ignore it. Some people throw a huge ceremony to celebrate a person moving from boy to a man or girl to a woman. Or sexual instinct. Humans have a sexual instinct, and cultures have had different reactions to how to control that, as to whom you can do that with, what sex you can do it with how many. Do you need to go through marriage to do that? It just depends on the culture. And that gets us into the concept of sex and gender, because sex is biological and gender is cultural. And we won't get into it a lot in this class, but we oftentimes identify that there are two sexes because we see two types of anatomy, but we think that ultimately means that there are two genders. But and we're starting to see that is not true in our own culture, but lots of cultures have known this for a long time. There's plenty of cultures that have third genders, fourth genders, where biological males take on female roles or biological females take on male roles. So if you think about it, you shouldn't really necessarily go to a gender reveal party. You should go to a sex reveal party, because what are you revealing about the baby? Their anatomy. But what their gender will be, we don't know, because that's more of a cultural affair. Culture is integrated. So anthropologists like to think of culture as a well-structured machine where all these different parts are working together. And one model that tries to show this is the barrel model of culture. And so there's the barrel. I'm going to make it go away. So all cultures have an environment that they live on. And they also have an infrastructure. So they have an economic system. How do they get what they need? Subsistence practices. How do they get the food they make? Are they food foragers? Do they grow it? Are they like us and have other people grow it, or have industrial agriculture? What kind of technology do they have? Then they have the social structure, which includes all those social relationships, like what's your government? How do you get married? How do you determine who is family? What are the gender roles in this society? And on the very tippy top, you have the superstructure, and that includes the religion, worldview, ideas, beliefs, values, national ideology, all those things that you keep up in your head. Well, culture shows us that those things are, well, I should say the barrel model of culture shows that those things are integrated and they feed into one another. And so certain parts of the barrel model speak to other parts of the barrel model. So, for example, if you live in an environment like the Arctic, you're probably not going to be practicing agriculture where you are. That's a particular subsistence practice that isn't good for that environment. So, the environment is going to be speaking to that particular subsistence practice, that infrastructure of that culture. Other things we see, for example, oftentimes cultures that whose subsistence practice, like food foragers, which we'll talk about, like Native Americans, who spend a lot of time in nature, that typically speaks to their religion up in their superstructure because they spend so much time in nature. They have a more naturalistic worldview. They see themselves as a part of nature instead of on top of it or in charge of it. Maybe we can come to gender roles. Cultures where women have more economic input, they're the main breadwinners, if you will, especially like horticultural societies where women are in the garden, you're going to see that. So here's subsistence practice. Women are doing most of the economic role. That's going to speak to the social structure because women are going to have a higher regard in that culture. And oftentimes we see that also speaking to the religion because you will see goddesses in cultures where women are seen as important economic members of that culture. All right, we're going to look at traditional notions of culture. So, back in the day when we were finding new people, it was thought that cultures culture was just something that indigenous people had, native people, and other people, the civilized people, if you will, did not have culture. It was also thought that people living in a culture were going to be homogenous, meaning the same, consolidated into a nice little package and separated. So, kind of like this. So, this idea that, oh, over here we have one culture and they are separate from this culture over here. So, maybe here's the Australians, here's the people from Botswana, here's Czech people, here are some Danes, and their cultures are separated, and we can go in there and study them as if they are in some kind of snow globe and we can look at them. But that ignores a lot of aspects of culture, like the fact that these cultures do not exist in a vacuum without other cultures around them. And even very remote cultures, very small cultures, still have some kind of contact with other groups of people. So when we think about cultures today, societies are very modern and complex. So when you think about these cultures and their barrels, if these circles were their barrel model, if you will, it's not that they are in this barrel away from everybody. It's really that this barrel, if you will, have holes in them, and these barrels are leaking their culture over other barrels, and other barrels are leaking on you. And so, really, you've got kind of a mixing. Like it says, the boundaries are porous. So, yes, maybe you have Americans here, but they are affected by other cultures that they have in contact with. So, even though they have their separate culture, there's always going to be that mixing. And we can't think of Americans as just studying them in their little barrel. We have to think about what other things affect them.